When I walked into that boardroom, my son smirked at me like I was already dead weight, and my daughter-in-law didn't even bother looking up from her phone. I was wearing the same faded flannel jacket I wear to feed the horses, work boots caked with dried mud, and I held my old ball cap in both hands like a beggar at the church door. I looked exactly like what they wanted me to look like, a worn-out old rancher who'd finally lost his grip. I saw my son Daniel lean over and whisper something to his wife Rachel, and she let out this tight little laugh behind her manicured hand. That laugh went through me like a blade between the ribs. To them, I was an embarrassment, a liability sitting at the end of a long glass table where I didn't belong anymore. But then the company's outside counsel, a man I'd never met, looked down at the folder in front of him, then looked up at me, and something changed in his face. His pen stopped moving. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the words. He looked at the name printed on his own paperwork, then back at me, and he went the color of old paper. "Wait," he said, so quiet I almost didn't catch it. Are you that Walter Higgins?" Everyone at that table turned to stare at me. The air conditioning hummed. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Rachel stopped smiling. Daniel's jaw went slack, like a man watching a ghost climb out of a grave he'd dug himself. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. Not yet. "My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 68 years old, and until 3 months ago, I thought the worst thing life could do to me had already happened when I buried my wife Corinne. I was wrong. Family, when you're my age and you've handed over the keys to everything you built, family can do something so much worse than grief. Grief is honest. It doesn't smile at you while it robs you blind. If you're sitting there listening to me right now, wherever you are, whatever kitchen table or porch swing or hospital waiting room you're in, I want you to know something before this story even gets going. I see you. I know some of you are carrying the same kind of weight I'm about to describe. So if you've got a minute, hit that like button for me. Would you? It costs you nothing, and it means the world to an old man trying to get his story heard. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight, because it does my heart good knowing who's sitting with me while I tell this. It started on a Tuesday in early spring, out on my property in the hill country outside of Bourne, Texas. Corinne had been gone 2 years by then, and the ranch, 42 acres she and I had built up from nothing over 3 decades, had become the only thing keeping my hands busy and my mind quiet. I raised cattle, not a huge operation, but a good one, profitable, paid off free and clear except for the equipment loans. I had also built a business alongside it, Higgins Fabrication, a small precision machine shop that made specialty parts for the oil and gas industry. 40 years I ran that shop with my own 2 hands before I finally stepped back and let my son Daniel take the president's chair 3 years ago. He'd gone and gotten himself a business degree, married a sharp young woman named Rachel, who worked in wealth management, whatever that meant exactly. And I figured foolishly, I know now that the future of everything I'd built was safe in their hands. That Tuesday, I was checking the mail out at the end of the long caliche driveway, same as I do every day, mostly seed catalogs and church bulletins and the occasional bill. But that day, there was a fat manila envelope from the county appraisal district with red block lettering stamped across the front. Final notice, delinquent taxes foreclosure, proceedings pending. My hands went cold holding that paper. I read it standing right there in the driveway with the wind kicking up dust around my boots. It said my property taxes on the ranch were 4 months past due, and if I didn't settle the account within 30 days, the county would begin seizing procedures. This made no sense to me whatsoever. I had personally wired $28,000 to Daniel 2 months prior, specifically to cover those taxes. He told me over Sunday dinner, patting my shoulder like I was a nervous old dog, that he'd handled it, that I shouldn't worry my head over paperwork anymore. That's what he was there for. I called Rachel first, since Daniel rarely answered his cell during business hours. She picked up on the 5th ring, and I could hear restaurant noise behind her, silverware clinking, somebody laughing too loud. "Walter, hi. I'm at a lunch thing. Can I call you back?" "Rachel, I need to know what happened to the tax payment," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I gave Daniel the money for this back in January." There was a pause, and the background noise seemed to dim like she'd stepped outside. "Walter, please don't get yourself worked up," she said, in that voice you use to calm down a confused toddler. "Daniel took care of that. You probably just got a duplicate letter from the county. They're always behind on their records. We'll swing by tonight after work and sort it all out. Just relax, okay?" They showed up around 7 that evening in Daniel's black pickup, The expensive one with the chrome package he'd bought last year, even though he'd told me the business was tight on cash. He came up the porch, steps in, pressed slacks and a golf polo, looking like a man without a worry in the world. Rachel followed behind, designer purse on her shoulder, wearing the exact same expression of exhausted patience she wears when she's forced to deal with anything unpleasant. I sat them both down in my living room and put the foreclosure letter flat on the coffee table between us. "Explain this to me," I said, tapping the red ink. Daniel didn't even pick it up. He leaned back into my recliner like he owned it and let out a long, put-upon sigh. "Dad, you're getting yourself worked up over nothing. I paid that months ago. The county system is a disaster, everybody knows that. This letter is dated 3 days ago, son," I said. "It says clearly, no payment received. If you paid it, show me the confirmation." Daniel exchanged a look with Rachel, one of those quick, tired glances that said, "Here we go again with the old man." "Dad, stop interrogating him," Rachel snapped, stepping in close and putting her hand on Daniel's shoulder like she was protecting him from me. "He's doing you a favor, managing all this. You know your memory hasn't been what it used to be." "I am not confused," I said. "I am reading a legal document." "You are confused, Walter," she said, raising her voice just enough to steamroll the room. "Do you not remember what happened last week? You forgot the dog's name. You called Daniel, asking what day it was. And yesterday," she paused here, drawing in a shaky little breath for effect. "Yesterday we drove out and found you'd left the propane burner going on the back porch. The whole side yard smelled like gas. You could have burned the entire house down, Walter." The room went dead quiet except for the old clock on the mantel that Corinne had bought at an estate sale 30 years back. I stared at my son and his wife and felt the floor tilt underneath me. The propane burner. For one terrible second, my mind actually tried to conjure up the memory, tried to hand me a picture of myself leaving that burner lit, because that's what fear does to you. It makes you doubt the one thing you know for certain. But I hadn't used that back porch burner in over a year. I'd disconnected the tank myself after Corinne passed, because cooking out there without her sitting beside me in her folding chair felt like a wound I didn't need reopened. It was physically impossible for that burner to have been running. A cold, sick feeling rolled through my gut. My daughter-in-law was lying to my face, and doing it well. Why would she invent something like that? Why did Daniel look so unbothered about a missing $28,000? I studied their faces the way I used to study men across a negotiating table when I was still running my shop, back when a supplier tried to slip a bad deal past me. And here's the thing, they'd forgotten, or maybe never really knew, about their old man. Before I ever bought that ranch, before I ever built Higgins Fabrication from a single rented garage bay into a company with 40 employees, I spent 11 years as a union negotiator representing tradesmen against corporations that would have eaten me alive if I'd blinked. I know what a manufactured story sounds like. I know the particular rhythm of a lie rehearsed in a car on the drive over. I was hearing that rhythm right now, coming out of my own children. Every instinct told me to stand up and throw them both out of my house and demand my money back on the spot. But my old negotiator's brain, the part of me that never fully retired, told me to wait. If I came at them hot without proof, they'd just tighten their story, use my anger as more evidence that I was losing it. So I did something that cost me more than I can say. I let my shoulders drop. I let my hands tremble a little more than they needed to. I looked down at the floor like a beaten man. I left the burner on," I mumbled, letting my voice crack. "Yes, Dad," Rachel said, instantly softening into that saccharine tone. "It scared us so bad. You're getting older, and with the grief still sitting on you, it's just a lot for you to manage alone anymore." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes down so they couldn't see the fury building behind them. "Maybe you're right," I whispered. I'm just so tired." Daniel stood, buttoning his jacket, satisfied. "Don't worry about the tax thing, Dad. I'll call the county Monday and get it straightened out. You focus on resting." As their truck pulled out of the driveway, I stood at the window and watched the taillights disappear down the hill, and my sadness curdled into something colder and much more useful. They thought they'd found a confused old fool sitting on a valuable piece of land. They had woken something up instead. Rachel showed up the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, letting herself in the back door the way she always did, carrying a small, unmarked orange pill bottle. She set it on my kitchen counter next to the coffee maker with that same practiced, patronizing smile. "Walter, I talked to Dr. Osei yesterday," she said, pouring herself coffee like this was her kitchen and not mine. He agrees. The grief and the isolation are hard on cognitive function at your age. He prescribed a supplement to help with memory and focus. I looked at that little bottle sitting there, so ordinary, so harmless looking. Something old and suspicious in the back of my skull, some leftover instinct from 30 years of watching men lie across a bargaining table, told me plainly, don't take it. But she was my daughter-in-law. She'd sat across from me at every Thanksgiving for 12 years. I told myself I was letting the stress of the tax notice make me paranoid, that I needed to trust my own family. So I swallowed the pill with my coffee, and Rachel kissed my cheek and left for work, promising she'd text every morning to remind me. Within 2 weeks, my body started falling apart in ways I couldn't explain. It began as a heaviness behind my eyes, a thick fog that settled over my thinking by mid-morning. I'd always been up at 5 to check the herd and do my books, and by the end of that first week I could barely drag myself out of bed before 9. My legs felt filled with wet cement. Then came the shaking. I dropped a coffee mug trying to lift it, watched it shatter on the tile, and just stood there staring at the pieces like they belonged to somebody else's kitchen. By the second week, my thoughts would form and then just dissolve before I could finish them, like trying to hold water in a fist. I sat down one evening to check my bank statements online, needing to trace that missing $28,000, and I stared at my own login screen like it was written in a foreign language. My hands shook so hard I kept mistyping the password, a password I'd used for 6 years, one built from Corinne's maiden name and our anniversary. The account locked after 3 failed attempts. I sat there in my empty kitchen with my hands over my face, more frightened than I'd been in decades. I was locked out of my own life, and I had no proof of anything. But underneath the fog, a single sharp thought kept cutting through, over and over. Daniel had sworn he'd fixed the tax problem. I needed proof he hadn't, and I needed to understand what these pills were actually doing to me. I knew better than to go to my regular doctor in town, since Rachel had listed herself as my medical proxy years back during a routine estate planning session I'd been too trusting to question. Any test ordered locally would ping straight to her phone. So, on a morning when the fog lifted just enough, I drove my old feed truck, the one with no GPS unit Daniel had installed in my newer vehicle for safety, 40 miles out to a rural clinic in the next county. I paid cash, gave a false name, and handed a tired-looking doctor one of the white capsules along with an extra $100 to rush the results. He frowned at it but didn't argue. The days that followed were an exercise in acting I never trained for. I kept swallowing the pills in front of Rachel and secretly spitting them into my palm the rest of the time, letting just enough of the real dose stay in my system to keep my hands trembling on command. Rachel and Daniel visited that Sunday bringing a box of donuts, Rachel breezing in with her usual fake cheer, Daniel checking his watch every 90 seconds like his own father's collapse was an inconvenient meeting he needed to wrap up. I fumbled a coffee mug on purpose, let it shatter across the floor, and dropped to my knees pretending to gather the pieces. From that angle, kneeling on my own kitchen tile, I caught their reflection in the sliding glass door behind me. Daniel wasn't looking at me with concern. His face had twisted into something closer to disgust. He leaned toward Rachel and murmured, just loud enough to carry, "He's basically done. Won't be long now." Rachel didn't correct him. She just nodded and handed him a paper towel. Something in me went perfectly still and perfectly clear in that moment. The fog seemed to burn off entirely, replaced by an old, familiar coldness I hadn't felt since my negotiating days, since staring down company lawyers who thought a man in work boots couldn't outthink them. I was not a broken old widower. I was a target these two amateurs had badly, catastrophically misjudged. I let my hands keep shaking. I let my voice keep cracking. But inside, the machine had switched back on. The next morning, when Rachel called to check that I'd taken my dose, I went into the bathroom, palmed the capsule, and flushed it down the toilet, watching the water carry away the last of my blind trust for her. I repeated that for 2 straight days. The withdrawal hit me like a truck, headaches, muscle cramps, cold sweats, but by the 3rd morning, my mind snapped back into sharp, clean focus for the first time in weeks. My hands were steady pouring coffee. I was myself again, but they couldn't know that. Whenever Rachel or Daniel came around, I kept performing, trembling on cue, letting my words trail off mid-sentence. I needed hard proof of what those pills actually were, and I needed to know what was really behind that missing tax money. I couldn't confront a mystery, so I called the one man I trusted with something this serious, an old friend from my union days, Marcus Webb, who'd gone on to become one of the most respected civil attorneys in San Antonio. We'd butted heads across negotiating tables for a decade before that friction turned into real respect. I called him from a prepaid phone I'd bought with cash at a gas station outside of town, because if Daniel and Rachel were bold enough to drug me, I had no doubt they were capable of checking my regular phone records too. Marcus, it's Walter. I'm on a burner. Don't call my regular number back. His voice went instantly serious. Walter, you don't buy a burner phone for small talk. What's going on? I laid it all out for him, the tax notice, the pills, the overheard comment in my kitchen the way I used to lay out a grievance case. Just the facts, no emotion. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Walter, he finally said, this sounds like they're setting you up for a forced guardianship. They're trying to build a medical case for your incompetence so they can take control of your assets. We need documentation, and we need it now. I told him I needed eyes inside my own house, something completely off the books. No security company with a paper trail Daniel could trace. Marcus told me he had a private investigations team he trusted completely. Former state troopers who did discreet surveillance work for his firm's higher-stakes cases. He promised to send them out that night. I left the back door unlocked and waited in the dark. At midnight, 2 unmarked trucks eased up my long driveway with their headlights off. 3 men in dark clothes moved fast and quiet toward my back door, carrying gear bags that looked like nothing more than tool duffels. They installed pinhole cameras in the crown molding of my living room and my home office, wires threaded invisibly behind the old drywall, feeds encrypted straight to a secure server at Marcus's firm. It should have taken 45 minutes. The old plaster fought them at every turn, and 90 minutes in, with wires still exposed across my living room floor and plaster dust dusting the hardwood, a small blue light flashed on the motion sensor I'd rigged years back at the front gate to track feed deliveries. Someone was coming up the drive. I pulled up the gate camera feed. A black SUV, moving slow so the gravel wouldn't announce her. Rachel. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. I hadn't texted her confirming my nighttime dose because I'd been too busy coordinating with Marcus, and she was clearly driving out here to force it down my throat herself. The tech crew had 2 minutes, maybe less, and there was no possible way they could pack up, sweep the plaster dust, and vanish before her headlights hit the porch. Go out the back. Now, I told the lead technician. Don't stop till you hit the tree line. I'll buy you the time. I threw open my front door and stepped straight out into freezing night air wearing nothing but a thin undershirt and pajama pants, letting the genuine shock of the cold hit my system, because real terror reads different than performed terror. I stumbled down the porch steps barefoot onto the frozen gravel, wrapping my arms around myself, letting my jaw go slack, and staggered toward her headlights like a man who'd lost every thread connecting him to reality. Corinne, I called out into the dark trees, my voice cracking with manufactured desperation. Corinne, is that you? I can't find my way back to the house. Where are you? Rachel slammed her door and marched toward me, cold fury radiating off her in the dark. What on earth are you doing out here, Walter? Get inside before you catch pneumonia. I kept stumbling past her, reaching for empty air, calling my dead wife's name, and I watched something shift in Rachel's expression, irritation curdling into a twisted kind of satisfaction. She thought her pills had finally broken me completely. She grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and started dragging me toward the porch, and I went limp, forcing her to drag my full weight, buying every extra second I could for the men working behind my back window. I dropped to my knees on the icy gravel. She yanked me up by the collar, cursing under her breath, calling me a foolish old man, dragging me bodily up the steps. By the time we crashed through my front door into the warm hallway, the living room behind us sat perfectly dark, perfectly still. Not a speck of dust or a stray wire in sight. The crew had vanished like smoke. Rachel forced a pill between my lips with a cup of water, watching my throat closely to make sure I swallowed. What she didn't see was the capsule I'd already tucked safely into my cheek. The moment her taillights disappeared down the drive, I spat it into the sink and looked up at the crown molding. A tiny red light blinked once in the shadows. The cameras were live. The hunt had officially begun. The following afternoon, I watched on a secure tablet Marcus had sent over as Daniel let himself into my house, believing me to be sedated upstairs. He moved straight to my home office, pulled back the rug covering my old floor safe, the one holding the original deed to the ranch, Corinne's jewelry, and the paperwork for Higgins' fabrication, and I watched him photograph every single page inside with his phone for nearly 20 minutes. When he finally left, Marcus called me on the burner, his voice tight with something I hadn't heard from him before, real alarm. Walter, we have a serious problem. My forensic accountant finished digging into Higgins Fabrication's books today. The company you handed your son is bleeding money. He's been propping up the balance sheet with short-term loans for over a year. And it's worse than that, he's personally indebted almost $11 million to a private lending group operating out of Dallas, the kind of people who don't send polite collection notices. The pieces fell into place with a sick, clean click. The fake tax crisis. The forced medication that made me look incompetent. The photographs of my deed and my company's founding documents. Daniel wasn't just greedy, he was drowning. And he needed my ranch and my company as collateral to keep himself alive with people who didn't forgive late payments. Every kind word Rachel had ever said to me, every cup of coffee she'd poured, had been one more brick in the wall they were building to bury me alive inside my own incompetence. I knew I could take this evidence to the police right then, but Marcus and I both understood it wouldn't be enough. Daniel would claim he was simply managing my affairs out of love. Rachel would cry in front of a judge about a devoted daughter-in-law trying to help a declining old man. I needed them to commit an act so blatant, so undeniable, that no lawyer on earth could spin it. I needed to force their hand. So I called Rachel and told her, in a deliberately weak, hopeful voice, that I was having a rare, clear morning and needed to talk to her about something important regarding the ranch. When she arrived that afternoon, I sat wrapped in a blanket in my recliner, positioned perfectly in the camera's frame, and told her, with tears I didn't have to fake, that I understood what was happening to my mind, that I could feel myself slipping, and that I'd called my attorney that morning to begin transferring the ranch and Higgins Fabrication into a land conservation trust in Corinne's name, effective the following Monday at 9 sharp. I watched every drop of color drain from Rachel's face. "Walter, you can't do that," she stammered. "You're not thinking straight. Daniel and I have plans for that property." I told her my mind was made up, that once the paperwork was signed, it would be irreversible. She fled my house in a panic, and I knew I'd just started a clock they couldn't ignore. Friday morning, before I'd even finished my coffee, 3 sheriff's cruisers and a white van marked with the county's Adult Protective Services seal came tearing up my driveway. Deputies moved across my porch with the tension of men expecting trouble, flanked by 2 caseworkers carrying thick folders. When I answered the door, playing every bit the confused, trembling old man, a caseworker named Denise handed me an emergency guardianship order, signed and stamped by a judge that same morning, granted without a hearing, without my knowledge, without me ever standing in front of anyone to defend myself. Daniel and Rachel arrived minutes later, Rachel sobbing into a tissue with theatrical precision, Daniel wearing a mask of devastated concern, so convincing it almost impressed me. "Dad, we tried everything we could to keep you safe at home," Rachel said, gripping my arm. "We had no choice." The paperwork told the rest of the story. 2 out-of-state doctors, neither of whom had ever examined me, had signed sworn statements describing aggressive cognitive decline, citing symptoms that were, in fact, chemically manufactured by the very woman standing beside me pretending to grieve. Every act I'd faked to protect my investigation had unknowingly built their legal case against me. As the deputies walked me toward the van, Rachel asked for one final moment, wrapped her arms around my neck for the cameras, and pressed her mouth to my ear. "Don't fight this, old man," she whispered, ice in every syllable. "You lost. Go quiet and maybe I'll pick a nice facility." I let her believe it completely. They never patted down the inside pocket of my wool coat, where a second burner phone sat pressed against my ribs. I offered zero resistance at the psychiatric facility because any flash of anger would only feed their narrative. I shuffled. I mumbled. I asked disoriented questions about what city I was in. Alone in my room that first night, I texted Marcus the details of the emergency order. His reply came fast. By law, they had 72 hours to hold a formal hearing to make the guardianship permanent. 72 hours was a narrow window, but it was enough. "Let them believe they've won," I typed back. "Don't file anything yet. Let them walk into that hearing thinking I'm finished." Marcus's forensic team had already traced the loan documents bearing my forged signature straight back to Daniel's Dallas creditors, and the hidden camera footage of him cracking my safe sat preserved on a secure server, untouchable. Rachel visited me Sunday afternoon carrying a cheap bouquet, speaking to me like a child, assuring me Daniel had everything under control. I let drool slide from the corner of my mouth and mumbled nonsense, and she left convinced her inheritance was secured. She had no idea she'd just walked into the final hours of her freedom. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. The clothes Rachel sent for the hearing were a deliberate insult. A stained work shirt, patched jeans, and my oldest, most beaten pair of boots, meant to make me look every bit the broken-down old rancher she needed the judge to see. I put them on without complaint. I shuffled through the courthouse halls with my head bowed, dragging one boot slightly, playing my part all the way to the defense table in that quiet civil courtroom. Daniel and Rachel sat at the plaintiff's table in matching expressions of practiced sorrow, flanked by a sharp litigator in an expensive suit who clearly expected an easy, unopposed morning. The bailiff called the room to order, and everyone rose except me. I stayed slumped in my chair, playing a man too far gone to understand the ritual. The judge took the bench, a graying man with reading glasses, and the plaintiff's attorney launched immediately into his opening, painting a devastating portrait of dementia and danger, walking the judge through the forged medical affidavits, then playing the video Rachel had recorded of me screaming Corinne's name barefoot in the frost. The judge watched it with visible sorrow. "As you can see, Your Honor," the lawyer said, closing his binder with a solemn nod, "my client's father is a profound danger to himself. We respectfully request the guardianship be made permanent." The room went silent, waiting for me to weep, to protest, to do anything but sit there. I let that silence stretch, let them drink in their false victory a moment longer. Then, slowly, I lifted my chin. I placed both hands flat on the table and let the trembling stop cold. I looked directly up at the judge for the first time. His pen dropped. All the color left his face at once, like watching a light switch flip. "My God," he whispered, leaning forward over the bench. Is this really you, Walter Higgins?" The plaintiff's attorney frowned, confused, stepping forward to ask if the court needed to call a medical professional for the respondent. The judge ignored him completely, his eyes locked on mine. "Your Honor," I said, and my voice came out low, level, and utterly unshaken, the voice I hadn't used in over a decade. The one I used across bargaining tables when men in expensive suits tried to steamroll working people who trusted me to protect them. "It's been a long time, Gerald," Rachel gasped audibly. Daniel's spine went rigid, the color bleeding out of his own face now. The judge, Gerald Voss, turned toward the stunned attorney with fury building behind his glasses. "You have no idea who is sitting at that table," he said. 20 years ago, I was a young public defender about to be disbarred over a mistake that wasn't even mine to fix. This man spent 6 months of his own time helping me untangle it during a labor dispute case, refused to take a dime for it, and saved my entire career. He built and ran one of the fairest shops in this state for 40 years. Are you telling me you diagnosed him with dementia?" I stood, my full height, the stooped posture falling away like a costume. "Your Honor," I said, "with the court's permission, I'll be representing myself." He granted it instantly, and right on cue, the courtroom doors swung open, and Marcus Webb strode down the center aisle, with 2 paralegals wheeling a cart of bankers' boxes behind him. I laid it all out, piece by piece, the forged affidavits and the doctors who'd already confessed under threat of federal perjury charges, the toxicology report confirming a systematic, unprescribed regimen of the exact medication that mimicked every symptom in their fraudulent filing, the credit card statement proving Rachel had purchased it herself, and finally, the hidden camera footage of Daniel cracking my safe frame by frame on the courtroom monitors, followed by the forensic trail connecting him to $11 million owed to men in Dallas who did not forgive debts. Daniel bolted for the exit before I'd even finished, shoving Rachel out of his chair on his way past her, and made it barely 10 feet down the aisle before 2 bailiffs tackled him into the gallery benches, cuffs ratcheting shut over his wrists. Rachel collapsed, screaming into her own hands. Judge Voss didn't hesitate. He voided the guardianship on the spot, restored my full legal rights, and ordered bench warrants issued for them both on charges of elder abuse, forgery, and fraud, freezing every account connected to Daniel's failing company before we'd even left the room. As deputies walked her out in handcuffs, Rachel dropped to her knees in the marble hallway and grabbed my boots, sobbing, begging me to make it stop, to remember she was family. I looked down at the woman who'd poisoned my coffee and whispered cruelty into my ear while I was loaded into a van, and I felt nothing shift in my chest at all. "You gave that up the day you put poison in my cup," I told her, and I pulled my boots free and walked away without looking back. 6 months later, Daniel was convicted on federal fraud and forgery charges, and sentenced to 12 years. Rachel received 7 for elder abuse and conspiracy, losing her license to manage anyone else's finances ever again. Their greed had built its own prison, brick by brick, far sturdier than anything I could have constructed myself. I went back to my ranch. With Marcus's help, I set up a trust in Corinne's name, using a good part of what I have left to fund legal aid for other seniors caught in the same trap I nearly didn't escape. Some mornings now I stand out on my back porch with my coffee, watching the sun climb over the hills, and I think about how betrayal so often wears a familiar face, how it hides behind the people who call you dad. We spend our whole lives building something to hand down to our children, only to learn too late that real security isn't in what you leave behind. It's in the boundaries you're willing to enforce while you're still standing. An old man resting on his porch might look like he's finished, but his mind's still sharp, and the truth always finds its way into the light eventually. If this story meant something to you tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell me down in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Take care of yourselves out there. I'll see you next time.